Thank you very much, Acting Speaker. And I too rise to speak on the State Taxation Amendment Bill. And from the outset, very disappointing that we're only getting a couple of hours this afternoon to debate this important piece of legislation, much like we had a situation after last year's budget where we saw the government ram through the state taxation bill, introduce it into the House, leave them less than 24 hours at the time for community consultation, for consultation with stakeholders, in a taxation bill that saw land tax increases, payroll tax increases, a new tax on non-government schools, and a COVID debt levy that was set to raise $8.9 billion over the coming years. And once again this year we're seeing the government curtail debate on the important issue of taxing Victorians, and look to guillotine this debate in under 2 hours of debate time, leaving many of my colleagues without the ability to speak on the piece of legislation. And just from the outset, Acting Speaker, to pick up on the member for Box Hill and indeed the member for Albert Park's point, and I can see that the talking points have gone around how the Allan Labor government has reduced taxes, somewhat of a confusing scenario with 55 now new or increased taxes over the past decade. Of course, we saw the then Premier Andrews, on the eve of the 2014 election, make that commitment to the Victorian people that there would be no new or increased taxes under a Labor government. 10 years down the track, 55 new or increased taxes. But just to the member for Box Hill's point around the reform that he's speaking to around payroll tax and the lifting of that threshold. Now, unfortunately, despite lifting that threshold, Victoria remains uncompetitive, with that threshold still being behind New South Wales, the threshold still being lower than Queensland, and the threshold still being below South Australia as well. And that simply makes it less competitive for Victorian businesses. And we know that the South Australian Premier is knocking at the door of Victoria, telling Victorian businesses, Victorian small businesses, don't bother in Victoria, they're going to tax you more, they're going to make it harder to do business. And we've seen the Victorian Chamber of Commerce's report that shows once again that the hardest state to do business is Victoria. So, unfortunately, lifting the payroll tax threshold doesn't do anything to compete with the other states, doesn't incentivise the businesses to grow, to expand and to set up here in Victoria. Now, Deputy Speaker, what is sure under this government, and I think it was Benjamin Franklin that said there's nothing that is certain in life other than death and taxes. Well, there's nothing that is more certain under the Allan Labor government other than record debt and higher taxes. And as I've said, this budget, 10 years of Labor budgets, 10 years of Labor's financial mismanagement. And what have we seen from that? Of course, we've seen blowouts, we've seen waste, we've seen reckless spending and record taxes. We have seen the tax revenue take increase from $17.8 billion in 2014 to a projected $45 billion over that 10-year period. That is a huge increase, and that impost is felt by Victorian households, by Victorian businesses, and when we talk about tax burden in this state, we know it is the highest tax burden in the country. Over $5,000 hanging over the heads of Victorians because of the decisions of this government to impose tax increase after tax increase and new tax after new tax. In this bill, we see, of course, and in this budget, a number of taxes increased. The waste levy increased and the fire service levy increased as well. And that fire services levy increase will only see that flow through to ratepayers through increased rates at a time that Victorians can least afford it. But one thing that hasn't really been spoken to about in this piece of legislation today are the changes to the vacant residential land tax. Now, these are changes that are being put in place by the government because when they put through these initial changes last year, they made a few mistakes. that resulted in those Victorians that hold their holiday home in a family trust being hit with land tax, unexpectedly hit with land tax. And they've had to correct that mistake. They've had to come into the parliament through this piece of legislation and correct their own mistake and say, apologies, we're going to backdate that and actually not see you pay land tax on your holiday home, which has been exempt from land tax and from the vacant residential tax for many, many years. Deputy Speaker, we saw in last year's budget and through last year a number of new taxes increased. And the COVID debt levy in particular, raising $8.9 billion, saw hundreds of thousands of Victorian homeowners and property investors hit with land tax for the very first time. Now, that is a tax that will flow through directly to renters in this state. And as the Shadow Treasurer said yesterday, we have seen a 17% increase in rents at a time when we've got a 1% vacancy rate here in Victoria. We have a housing crisis, we have a rental crisis, and the answer from this government is to increase taxes on property. And in their landmark statement last year, the housing statement that they all like to speak to, the 80,000 homes targeted over each and every year over the next decade, something that we're seeing spoken less about at the moment. Just a few days after that announcement, that target of 80,000 homes was announced, we saw the Treasurer come out at an industry breakfast and say to the property industry, but we're going to hit you with a raft of new taxes. We're going to hit you with a number of new taxes that is going to make it harder for you to build new homes in this state. Now, we all know that the answer to the housing crisis, to the rental crisis, is to increase supply. Yet what we are seeing through the increases to land tax are the property investors taking their properties off the market, putting them up for sale in record numbers, resulting in less properties available on the rental market. And in this year's budget, what we can see is, one, of course, no relief across any taxation, but an average increase of 6.3% of land tax over the coming years. And then, of course, there was the increase to payroll tax, and we've saw that hit on businesses after the recent increase to payroll tax through the mental health levy, another hit to businesses in this state. And, of course, the introduction of the schools tax, a tax that was initially set out in the budget to hit 110 schools across Victoria, but the government realised its mistake, realised that those schools that had a fee threshold of $8,500 simply couldn't afford it, that families would have to pull out their children from those schools and lift that threshold in a backtrack from this government. And now we see 59 schools, after one of those schools, and our school in my own electorate, managed to get an exemption, managed to appeal to the minister and say, we are a school of 22 kids, a school that provides specialised education, and you are hitting us with a $15,000 tax bill that we simply cannot afford. Now, those schools, they are passing through that cost, of course, to their families, up to $1,000 a year in fees. Now, 59 schools on the list at the moment, but that is only set to increase, with the government refusing to index that $15,000 threshold. And we know that there are a number of schools that are likely to be included on the list in the coming 12 months, whether that's Alice Miller School in the electorate of Macedon, Elphington Grammar in the electorate of Northcote, Ballarat and Clarendon College and Ballarat Grammar in Wendouree, Girton Girls Grammar in Bendigo West, Cardinia International College in the electorate of Lara, and North Eastern Montmorency School in the electorate of Eltham. These are all schools that are likely to be included on the schools hit list in the coming years because the government refuses to set that rate of $15,000 with indexation. Deputy Speaker, this government continues to tax Victorians. They continue to take and take and take. And with their debt bill rising, with it set to hit $188 billion in the coming years, their answer is to tax Victorians more, to try and tax their way out of this problem. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is the debt rising, the deficit deepening this year despite that increased tax take, and that is resulting in a greater burden on Victorians at a time they cannot afford it. This government, they cannot manage money, they cannot manage major projects, and it's Victorians that are paying the price.
Member for